The morning mist clung to the Amazon River like a burial shroud when the trading canoe rounded the bend toward Hoer Verde on February 5, 1923. What the three Brazilian traders expected to find was a bustling riverside settlement of 600 souls preparing for another day of survival in the world's most unforgiving jungle. Instead, they discovered a ghost town that would haunt investigators for generations. The implications of what happened at Hoer Verde stretch far beyond a single vanished community. This case challenges everything we think we know about mass disappearances and the fragile line between civilization and the wild. The traders who first witnessed this impossibility couldn't have imagined they were documenting one of the most perplexing mysteries in South American history. Manuel Santos guided his dugout canoe through the tea-colored water, his weathered hands gripping the paddle as his two companions scanned the approaching shoreline. The humid air pressed against their skin like a damp blanket, thick with the scent of rotting vegetation and river mud. At 26 degrees Celsius, with humidity hovering above 80%, the Amazon dawn felt more like breathing through wet cloth than morning air. "Something's wrong," muttered Jose, the youngest of the three. The usual sounds were missing, no children's laughter echoing across the water, no morning cooking fires sending smoke spirals into the canopy, no women beating laundry against the wooden docks. Even the ubiquitous cicadas seemed muted, their mechanical shriek reduced to an anxious whisper. As their canoe scraped against the muddy bank, the silence hit them like a physical force. Hoer Verde stretched before them, a collection of wooden houses on stilts connected by raised walkways, exactly as they remembered from their last trading visit 6 weeks earlier. But the settlement that had once buzzed with the daily rhythm of Amazonian life now lay as quiet as a cemetery at midnight. Santos stepped onto the dock, his boots squelching in the soft wood dampened by perpetual river mist. The trading post where they'd always conducted business stood with its door hanging open, revealing darkness within. A cooking pot sat abandoned on a nearby porch, cold ashes beneath it, suggesting the fire had died hours or days ago. The three men exchanged nervous glances. Disease was always a possibility in these remote settlements. Yellow fever could sweep through a community like wildfire, and malaria claimed lives with ruthless efficiency. But sick people didn't simply vanish, they left bodies. They left evidence of struggle. They left someone behind to tell the tale. "Hello," Santos called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive jungle canopy. "Anyone there?" The echo of his words faded into the green labyrinth, answered only by the gentle lapping of river water against the wooden pilings. Not even a dog barked in response, an ominous sign in a settlement where mongrels typically announced every visitor from half a mile away. They moved deeper into the village, their footsteps hollow on the elevated walkways. House after house revealed the same disturbing pattern. Doors ajar, personal belongings undisturbed, meals half prepared and long since cold. In one home, they found a child's wooden toy floating in a rain barrel. In another, a woman sewing sat precisely where she'd left it, needle still threaded, fabric folded, as if she'd planned to return in moments. The humid air carried the sweet, sick smell of decomposition, but not from human remains, rather from fruit rotting in abandoned gardens and flowers wilting in window boxes. Vines had already begun their inevitable reclamation, green tendrils creeping across door frames and through broken shutters with the relentless patience of the jungle. What could cause 600 people to abandon everything they owned and disappear without a trace into the Amazon wilderness? Political upheaval raged across Brazil in 1923, with the revolution of 1923 tearing through Rio Grande do Sul and anti-government sentiment spreading like contagion. Could guerrilla forces have driven an entire community into the jungle? But the traders found no signs of violence, no bullet holes in walls, no overturned furniture suggesting hasty evacuation. If anything, the scene suggested people had simply walked away from their lives in the middle of ordinary activities, as if responding to some silent summons only they could hear. The mystery deepened when they discovered the schoolhouse, a single-room wooden structure at the village center that would provide the only tangible clue to Hoer Verde's fate. Before we dive into what they found in that classroom, I want to hear from you watching this story unfold. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. And if you're as intrigued by this mystery as I am, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we're about to discover in that abandoned schoolhouse will challenge everything you think you know about human behavior. The door to the one-room school stood open, like a mouth frozen in an eternal scream, and what lay beyond that threshold would transform a simple trading expedition into a legend that refuses to die. A single rifle lay across the wooden floor of the schoolhouse like a metallic exclamation mark, its barrel pointing toward a blackboard that bore 4 words written in precise chalk strokes. There is no salvation. This cryptic message would become the only physical evidence left behind by 600 vanished souls, launching decades of speculation about what drove an entire community into the Amazon's green embrace. Manuel Santos stepped carefully into the dim classroom, his boots creaking against floorboards swollen with jungle humidity. Shafts of filtered sunlight pierced through gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stagnant air. The familiar smell of chalk dust mingled with the ever-present scent of damp wood and creeping vegetation that defined every structure in the Amazon basin. The rifle, a well-maintained hunting weapon common to frontier settlements, showed no signs of recent use. No powder burns stained the wooden stock. No blood spattered the floor around it. Santos lifted the weapon with practiced hands, checking the chamber. Empty. Whatever had transpired here, it hadn't involved gunfire. But it was the blackboard that commanded their attention. The message dominated the teaching surface in letters large enough to read from the back row, written with the deliberate penmanship of someone accustomed to instructing children. Below the ominous declaration, mathematical problems remained half-worked, abandoned mid-lesson, as if the teacher had paused to write those 4 words, and then simply vanished. "There is no salvation," Jose read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to hang in the humid air, like an accusation. The third trader, Carlos, crossed himself reflexively. A devout Catholic like most rural Brazilians, he recognized the theological weight of the statement. The phrase echoed the Latin axiom, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, outside the church. There is no salvation, a cornerstone of Catholic doctrine that any village schoolteacher would have known by heart. But why write it? Was this a religious lesson interrupted by catastrophe, or something far more sinister, a final message left by someone who had glimpsed whatever drove 600 people into the wilderness? The classroom held other mysteries. A half-eaten apple sat on the teacher's desk, brown with oxidation, but not yet crawling with insects. Children's slates lay scattered across wooden benches, some bearing the careful script of spelling exercises, others decorated with the idle doodles that had entertained young minds for generations. Everything suggested normalcy interrupted, as if an entire lesson had simply evaporated into the thick Amazon air. Santos examined the walls more closely. Maps of Brazil hung askew, their corners curled from constant humidity. A collection of bird feathers, likely gathered for a nature lesson, remained pinned to a corkboard, their colors still vibrant despite the moisture that rotted everything in the jungle within months. The dedication required to maintain such educational materials in this environment spoke to a community invested in its children's futures. Yet all of it had been abandoned in an instant. The rifle bothered Santos most. In frontier settlements, weapons never lay carelessly on floors. They were too valuable, too essential for survival. Someone had placed it there deliberately, but why? As a warning? A symbol? Or simply dropped in? Whatever panic had seized the village, Carlos discovered another detail that deepened the mystery. A clay water pitcher sat precisely in the corner where it had always been during their previous visits, but it was bone dry. In a climate where condensation beaded on every surface and rain fell more than 200 days per year, nothing stayed dry without constant attention. How long had the schoolhouse stood empty? The mathematical evidence on the blackboard provided one clue. Santos recognized the lesson basic arithmetic problems suitable for children aged 7 to 10, but the calculations remained half-finished, numbers trailing off mid-equation as if the chalk had simply fallen from the teacher's hand. Whatever had interrupted this ordinary morning lesson had struck with the suddenness of lightning. Outside the schoolhouse, the jungle pressed closer with each passing hour. Vines that had been mere whispers against the walls during their previous visit now coiled around window frames like green serpents. The Amazon's patient hunger for human habitation was already visible within months. The forest would reclaim what civilization had carved from its domain. The traders spent another hour searching the settlement, but found no additional clues. No hastily packed belongings suggested planned evacuation. No signs of violence indicated forced removal. The only evidence that 600 people had ever called this place home was the infrastructure they'd left behind, and that cryptic message in the schoolhouse. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the silent village, an uncomfortable realization settled over the three men. They were witnessing something that shouldn't exist: the complete disappearance of an entire community without explanation, motive, or trace. In an age when people didn't simply vanish, when families had roots deeper than the massive cecropia trees towering overhead, such an event challenged the natural order itself. But the mystery of Hoer Verde was only beginning. The message in that schoolhouse, whether desperate warning, religious lesson, or something else entirely, would soon attract attention far beyond three bewildered traders. What forces could compel 600 people to abandon everything they'd built and walk into certain death in the world's most unforgiving wilderness? And why would the story of their disappearance first surface not in Brazilian newspapers, but in the pages of a Soviet publication thousands of miles away? The first printed account of Hoer Verde's disappearance emerged not from Brazilian authorities or local newspapers, but from the pages of Pravda, the official publication of the Soviet Communist Party, sometime in the mid-1920s. This bizarre editorial decision would prove to be just the first of many red flags, suggesting that the world's most famous vanished village might never have existed at all. In the smoky newsrooms of Moscow, where Lenin's revolution still cast long shadows across every printed word, editors at Pravda saw opportunity in Brazil's distant tragedy. The story fit perfectly into the communist narrative of capitalist societies collapsing under their own contradictions. Here was an entire settlement of oppressed workers, driven to desperation by oligarchic exploitation, choosing death in the jungle over continued servitude to coffee barons and rubber merchants. But why would the Soviet Union's premier propaganda machine concern itself with an obscure Amazon settlement? The answer lay in the political chaos consuming Brazil during 1923, a year that would test the young republic's commitment to democratic governance. The revolution of 1923 had erupted across Rio Grande do Sul that January, spreading like wildfire through Brazil's southernmost state. What began as protests against a disputed presidential election quickly metastasized into full-scale rebellion. Armed federalist forces clashed with government troops in battles that claimed thousands of lives, while political writers in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro warned of looming civil war. Against this backdrop of national upheaval, stories of vanished settlements took on heightened significance. If guerrilla forces could drive 600 people from their homes, what did that say about the government's ability to protect its citizens? Soviet propagandists understood the power of such narratives. They transformed isolated tragedies into indictments of entire economic systems. Yet something about the Hoer Verde story never sat right with careful observers. The town's name itself raised immediate suspicions among linguists and regional experts. Hoer was unmistakably Dutch slang, crude slang meaning whore, while Verde was clearly Portuguese for green. Such a linguistic combination was not just improbable in the Brazilian Amazon, it was virtually impossible. Dutch influence in South America had concentrated primarily in Suriname and parts of Venezuela, regions hundreds of miles from the central Amazon basin. Portuguese settlers, who had dominated Brazilian colonization for over 3 centuries, would never have adopted such crude Dutch terminology for their settlements. The name suggested someone unfamiliar with Brazilian linguistic patterns had fabricated the entire story. Dr. Helena Vasquez, a toponymy specialist at the University of São Paulo, would later observe that Brazil hosted dozens of settlements with Verde in their names Rio Verde, Vila Verde, Cabo Verde, creating ample opportunity for confusion or deliberate misdirection. A genuine story from one of these locations could easily be transplanted to a fictional Hoer Verde by writers seeking to obscure their sources. But in 1923, such academic analysis lay decades in the future. The immediate concern for Brazilian authorities was the very real chaos consuming their nation. Government forces struggled to contain the Southern Rebellion while maintaining order in remote regions where federal authority had always been tenuous at best. The Amazon, with its vast distances and minimal infrastructure, remained particularly vulnerable to rumors and unrest. River transport dominated the region's economy in 1923. Small steam launches and dugout canoes called ubas by local inhabitants threaded through tributary networks that connected isolated settlements to the outside world. Roads were virtually non-existent, making communities like the alleged Hoer Verde dependent on waterways for everything from mail delivery to emergency assistance. This isolation made the Amazon fertile ground for wild stories. When communication depended on messages carried by canoe between settlements days apart, rumors could spread and transform like jungle vegetation, growing more elaborate with each retelling until fact became indistinguishable from fiction. The rubber boom's collapse a decade earlier had left the region particularly susceptible to tales of abandonment and despair. Dozens of upriver settlements had genuinely emptied when latex prices crashed after 1912, leaving behind the ghostly remains of processing stations and worker barracks. Anyone traveling the Amazon's remote tributaries could witness authentic examples of human habitation swallowed by jungle, making stories like Hoer Verde disturbingly plausible. Political agitators of the era understood this psychological vulnerability. Writers attacking coffee baron oligarchs found eager audiences among populations that had watched their economic foundations crumble. References to guerrilla forces driving villagers into the jungle resonated with people who remembered how quickly prosperity could vanish in the Amazon's unforgiving embrace. The timing of Hoer Verde's alleged disappearance, February 5, 1923, placed it precisely at the height of Brazil's political crisis. Revolutionary fervor gripped the nation as Federalist rebels gained ground in Rio Grande do Sul and anti-government sentiment spread northward. If an entire Amazon settlement had indeed vanished during this period, it would have represented a devastating propaganda victory for government opponents. Yet no Brazilian newspaper of the period, not the influential Correio da Manhã in Rio de Janeiro, not the Estado de São Paulo, not even regional publications in Pará or Amazonas, carried any account of the disappearance. For a story of such magnitude, to avoid all domestic coverage while appearing in a Soviet publication thousands of miles away defied credibility. The silence from local authorities was equally telling. Amazon settlements regularly reported to state capitals regarding population changes, tax collection, and administrative matters. The complete disappearance of 600 citizens should have triggered immediate investigation and extensive documentation. Instead, the story existed only in foreign whispers and second-hand accounts, like smoke drifting across the river from a fire no one could locate. How does a settlement of 600 people vanish from both the physical landscape and the official record, while somehow reaching the attention of Soviet propagandists? The answer to that question would require investigators to dig deeper into Brazil's complex relationship with truth, mythology, and the seductive power of a perfect mystery. Brazilian authorities launched their investigation into the Hoer Verde disappearance in March of 1923, dispatching a team of federal officials upriver to locate what should have been one of the Amazon's most infamous crime scenes. They found nothing, not because the evidence had been destroyed, but because there was no evidence to find, no settlement to investigate, and no record that 600 people had ever called such a place home. The investigation team, led by Captain Roberto Mendoza of the Brazilian Frontier Guard, departed from Manaus on March 15th aboard the steamboat São Gabriel. Their mission seemed straightforward: locate the vanished settlement, document the scene, and determine what had befallen its residents. What they discovered instead was a mystery far more complex than mass disappearance. The Amazon in 1923 was littered with genuine ghost towns, casualties of the rubber boom's spectacular collapse a decade earlier. When latex prices plummeted after 1912, entire communities had indeed emptied overnight, leaving behind a landscape of abandoned processing stations, rotting barracoins, and silent wharves where steamboats once loaded fortunes in processed rubber. Captain Mendoza's team encountered dozens of these authentic ruins during their search. At one site, they found the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving extraction operation. Wooden platforms collapsing into the river, metal equipment rusting in the perpetual humidity, and worker quarters slowly surrendering to the jungle's inexorable advance. The sweet smell of decay permeated everything, not from human remains, but from the constant decomposition of organic matter in a climate where temperatures averaged 24 degrees Celsius and humidity never dropped below 80%. These genuine abandoned settlements provided a template that made the Hoer Verde story disturbingly plausible. Anyone who had witnessed the Amazon's capacity to swallow human habitation could easily imagine an entire community vanishing into the green labyrinth. Wooden structures rotted within months in the crushing humidity, while jungle vegetation reclaimed clearings with shocking speed. Metal corroded, paper disintegrated, and even stone foundations cracked under the assault of root systems that could split boulders. But there was a crucial difference between these real ghost towns and the alleged location of Hoer Verde. The genuine ruins left traces, census records documenting their populations, commercial registers listing their businesses, shipping manifests recording their trade relationships with downstream markets. Even after abandonment, bureaucratic evidence of their existence persisted in government archives. The investigation team's most experienced guide, an elderly caboclo named Fernando, who had navigated Amazon tributaries for over 40 years, claimed intimate familiarity with every significant settlement in the region. He could recite the histories of dozens of communities when they were founded, who led them, what crops they cultivated, and why they succeeded or failed. But when questioned about Hoer Verde, Fernando's weathered face creased in confusion. "Never heard of such a place," he insisted, his Portuguese heavily accented with the indigenous influences common to river people. "And that name, it makes no sense. No Brazilian would name a settlement like that." The team's linguistic expert, Dr. Carlos Ribeiro, from the University of Pará, had reached the same conclusion. The toponym Hoer Verde represented an impossible hybrid Dutch vulgarity mixed with Portuguese description in a region where such linguistic collision would never occur naturally. Real Amazon settlements bore names rooted in indigenous languages, Portuguese colonial history, or Catholic saints. They didn't combine crude European slang with standard Portuguese adjectives. As their search expanded, the investigation uncovered another troubling fact. Brazilian census records from 1920 and 1923 contained no reference to any settlement named Hoer Verde. The national government maintained meticulous population records for tax collection and military conscription purposes. A community of 600 residents would have generated extensive documentation, birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, and commercial permits. None existed. Captain Mendoza's team spent 6 weeks methodically exploring tributaries throughout the central Amazon basin. They interviewed traders, missionaries, government officials, and indigenous leaders who might have encountered such a settlement. The response was universal. No one had heard of Hoer Verde, and no one could imagine where such a place might have existed. The investigation did reveal how easily misinformation could spread in the Amazon's isolated communities. Stories traveled along river networks like diseases, mutating with each retelling until original facts became unrecognizable. A genuine tragedy at one settlement could transform into an entirely fictional account at another, complete with new names, different locations, and altered circumstances. Dr. Maria Santos, an anthropologist studying Caboclo culture, documented this phenomenon during the same period. She recorded how a real drowning accident at Rio Verde had spawned versions involving everything from supernatural river spirits to government conspiracies, depending on who told the story and where they lived. Within months, the original incident had generated a dozen variants, bearing only passing resemblance to actual events. The Amazon's unique geography amplified this effect. Settlements separated by days of river travel existed in effective isolation from each other, connected only by occasional trading expeditions and the stories those traders carried. Information flowed slowly and unreliably, creating conditions where rumors could flourish unchecked by contradictory evidence. Real environmental factors made the Hoer Verde story particularly seductive. The Amazon's climate could indeed erase human habitation with shocking thoroughness. Annual rainfall exceeding 2 meters turned wooden structures into rotting monuments within seasons, while humidity levels that never dropped below 80% created perfect conditions for rapid decomposition. Jungle vegetation grew with supernatural speed. Clearings could disappear under green canopies in less than a year. These conditions meant that even if Hoer Verde had existed, physical evidence of its presence might have vanished completely by the time investigators arrived. The story's plausibility lay not in its details, but in the Amazon's demonstrated capacity to swallow entire human endeavors without leaving traces. But plausibility and truth were different things entirely. As Captain Mendoza's investigation concluded in late April, one fact had become undeniable. Whatever had happened to create the Hoer Verde legend, it hadn't involved 600 people disappearing from a real Amazon settlement. The question that haunted investigators was more disturbing than mass disappearance. How had a completely fictional story gained such widespread credibility that it reached international attention and triggered a federal investigation? The answer would lead them into the murky world of early 20th century journalism, political propaganda, and the dangerous intersection between truth and compelling narrative. The Hoer Verde story spread through early 20th century media like wildfire through dry timber, jumping from Soviet propaganda sheets to European sensationalist publications to American penny papers, with each retelling adding new embellishments and supposed evidence. This pattern of viral misinformation revealed as much about the era's journalistic practices as it did about humanity's appetite for compelling mysteries, especially when those mysteries served convenient political narratives. The chain of transmission began with Pravda's original account, which Soviet editors had crafted to illustrate the inevitable collapse of capitalist exploitation in South America. But the story didn't remain confined to communist publications. It proved too irresistible for that. Within months, variations appeared in sensationalist European tabloids that specialized in exotic tales from distant lands, each version slightly different from its predecessor. French publications added romantic flourishes about doomed lovers and mysterious jungle spirits. German papers emphasized the scientific impossibility of such mass disappearances, while British colonial publications used the story to highlight the dangers facing European settlers in uncivilized territories. By the time American newspapers picked up the tale in 1924, It bore only passing resemblance to the original Soviet account. This evolution illustrated a fundamental problem with frontier journalism in the 1920s. International communication remained primitive and expensive, making fact-checking across continents virtually impossible for most publications. Editors relied on second-hand sources, translated documents, and the testimony of travelers whose credibility was impossible to verify. Stories from remote regions like the Amazon were particularly vulnerable to distortion because so few readers possessed first-hand knowledge that could contradict false claims. The political climate of 1923 created perfect conditions for the Hoer Verde legend to flourish. Brazil's revolution of 1923 had captured international attention as a symbol of Latin American instability, making stories of government oppression and popular uprising highly marketable to global audiences. Publications across the political spectrum found ways to use the vanished village narrative to support their ideological positions. Conservative papers in Europe and North America used Hoer Verde to illustrate the chaos threatening civilized society in regions where government authority remained weak. Progressive publications seized on the story as evidence of capitalist exploitation, driving desperate people to choose death over continued oppression. Both interpretations ignored the absence of verifiable facts in favor of narratives that confirmed existing beliefs. Dr. Patricia Lombardi, a journalism historian at the University of São Paulo, would later document how the Hoer Verde story exemplified what she termed colonial journalism, the practice of European and American publications treating distant lands as sources of exotic entertainment rather than subjects deserving serious investigation. Reporters felt no obligation to verify claims about places their readers would never visit and people they would never meet. The Amazon was particularly susceptible to such treatment. Its reputation as an impenetrable wilderness, populated by savage tribes and mysterious phenomena, made it a perfect setting for impossible tales. Readers in London or New York possessed no frame of reference to distinguish plausible Amazon stories from complete fabrications, allowing journalists extraordinary creative freedom when crafting narratives about the region. Real conditions in the Amazon lent credibility to even the most outlandish claims. The jungle's documented capacity to harbor undiscovered species, unmapped territories, and isolated human populations made stories like Hoer Verde seem entirely possible. When legitimate explorers regularly returned from the region with accounts of genuine wonders, previously unknown animals, uncontacted tribes, ruins of lost civilizations, fictional tales blended seamlessly with authenticated discoveries. The rubber boom's recent collapse provided additional authenticity. Dozens of Amazon settlements had indeed emptied dramatically when latex prices crashed, leaving behind ghostly reminders of vanished prosperity. Anyone who had witnessed these real abandonments could easily imagine more extreme examples, especially during a period of political upheaval that threatened stability throughout Brazil. Contemporary accounts reveal how quickly fictional details became accepted as established fact through repetition across multiple publications. The rifle in the schoolhouse, mentioned in the original Pravda account, became a military-grade weapon in French versions, suggesting government forces had been involved. The blackboard message, "There is no salvation," evolved into longer, more elaborate pronouncements in German publications, supposedly copied verbatim by investigators who had never actually visited the site. American papers added the most sensationalistic embellishments. Some versions claimed the vanished villagers had been discovered living with indigenous tribes deeper in the jungle. Others suggested supernatural explanations involving ancient curses or environmental catastrophes. Each retelling layered additional fictional details onto an already fabricated foundation, creating an increasingly elaborate mythology that bore no relationship to any real events. The absence of Brazilian sources challenging these international accounts proved particularly damaging to truth. Portuguese-language newspapers remained largely regional in 1923, lacking the international reach necessary to counter false narratives spreading through European and American media. By the time Brazilian journalists became aware of the Hoer Verde legend, it had already achieved such wide circulation that debunking seemed impossible. Local historians in Pará and Amazonas states, who possessed intimate knowledge of their region's settlement patterns, found themselves ignored by international publications that preferred sensational fiction to mundane facts. When respected Brazilian academics insisted that no settlement named Hoer Verde had ever existed, foreign editors dismissed their expertise as incomplete or politically motivated. This pattern revealed a deeper problem with early 20th century information networks. Stories originating in prominent international publications carried more credibility than contradictory evidence from regional sources, regardless of which possessed superior factual knowledge. The Hoer Verde legend benefited enormously from this bias, gaining authority through repetition in prestigious foreign papers, while legitimate Brazilian experts were marginalized or ignored entirely. The story's viral spread also demonstrated how political utility could override factual accuracy in news reporting. Publications across the ideological spectrum found the Hoer Verde narrative too useful for their propaganda purposes to abandon, even when evidence of its fictional nature became available. Conservative papers continued using it to illustrate socialist threats to civilization, while progressive publications maintained it as an example of capitalist oppression long after Brazilian authorities had conclusively debunked the entire tale. But the most disturbing aspect of the Hoer Verde phenomenon wasn't its initial creation or international spread. It was what happened when serious investigators finally attempted to trace the story back to its origins. What they discovered would challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between journalism, truth, and public trust in an era when information traveled faster than verification. When Dr. Helena Vasquez began her systematic investigation of the Hoer Verde legend in 1978, she expected to uncover a tragic story buried beneath decades of sensationalist reporting and political manipulation. Instead, she discovered something far more unsettling: a fictional narrative so perfectly crafted that it had fooled legitimate researchers, government officials, and international media for over half a century. Dr. Vasquez worked methodically through Brazilian National Archives, housed in the climate-controlled vaults beneath Brasilia's Ministry of the Interior. The sterile fluorescent lighting and antiseptic smell of preservation chemicals created an atmosphere entirely removed from the humid chaos of the Amazon. Yet her research would ultimately lead back to that green labyrinth, where truth and fiction intertwined like jungle vines. Her investigation began with census records, the most reliable documentation of Brazil's population during the early 20th century. Government bureaucrats had maintained meticulous records of settlements throughout the Amazon basin, driven by practical needs for tax collection, military conscription, and resource allocation. Every legitimate community of significant size generated a paper trail spanning multiple government departments. Hoer Verde appeared in none of these records. The 1,920 Brazilian census, conducted with unprecedented thoroughness as part of post-World War modernization efforts, documented settlements throughout Pará and Amazonas states in exhaustive detail. Rural communities with as few as 50 residents received official recognition and statistical analysis. The survey teams had traveled extensively by river, reaching remote settlements that existed days of canoe travel from major population centers. Yet among the hundreds of documented Amazon communities, no trace of Hoer Verde could be found. Dr. Vasquez expanded her search to commercial records maintained by the Ministry of Development. Amazon settlements in the early 1920s survived through trade relationships with downstream markets, shipping, agricultural products, rubber, Brazil nuts, and other forest products to major cities in exchange for manufactured goods, tools, and supplies. These transactions generated customs documents, shipping manifests, and commercial licenses that preserved detailed records of economic activity. Again, no reference to Hoer Verde appeared anywhere in the archives. Her investigation of religious records proved equally fruitless. The Catholic Church maintained comprehensive documentation of parishes throughout Brazil, including remote Amazon missions that served scattered rural populations. Priests recorded baptisms, marriages, deaths, and community events in ledgers that provided intimate portraits of frontier life. A settlement of 600 residents would have supported at least one parish and generated decades of ecclesiastical documentation. The church's archives contain no evidence that Hoer Verde had ever existed. Most damning of all was the absence of any administrative correspondence regarding the alleged disappearance. When legitimate Amazon settlements faced crises, disease outbreaks, indigenous conflicts, economic collapse, local officials generated extensive communications with state and federal authorities requesting assistance, reporting casualties, and documenting government response efforts. Such correspondence created permanent administrative records that survived long after the original emergencies were resolved. Dr. Vasquez found no government communications about Hoer Verde's disappearance, no requests for investigation, no reports of missing persons, and no documentation of any official response to what should have been one of the most significant tragedies in Amazon history. Her linguistic analysis provided the final proof of the story's fictional nature. The toponym Hoer Verde represented an impossible linguistic hybrid that could never have emerged naturally in the Brazilian Amazon. Hoer was unmistakably Dutch slang, crude slang, meaning prostitute, while Verde was standard Portuguese for green. Such a combination violated every known pattern of place name formation in colonial and post-colonial Brazil. Portuguese settlers who had dominated Brazilian colonization for over 3 centuries followed predictable naming conventions: indigenous words for geographic features, saints' names for religious communities, or Portuguese descriptions of local characteristics. They would never have combined vulgar Dutch slang with Portuguese adjectives, particularly in the Amazon where Dutch influence was virtually non-existent. Dr. Vasquez consulted with toponymy experts throughout South America, seeking any precedent for such linguistic mixing. The response was unanimous. The name Hoer Verde could only have been created by someone unfamiliar with Brazilian naming patterns, most likely a foreigner attempting to construct a plausible-sounding Portuguese place name without understanding the cultural and linguistic rules that govern such formations. Her research revealed how Brazil's complex geography had provided perfect camouflage for the fictional settlement. The nation contained dozens of communities with Verde in their names: Rio Verde, Vila Verde, Cabo Verde, Monte Verde, creating ample opportunity for confusion or deliberate misdirection. A genuine news story from any of these legitimate settlements could easily be transplanted to a fictional Hoer Verde by journalists seeking to obscure their sources or create more dramatic narratives. The Amazon's reputation for mystery and danger made such fabrications particularly effective. International audiences possessed no detailed knowledge of Brazilian geography, making it impossible for most readers to distinguish plausible locations from complete inventions. The region's documented capacity to harbor undiscovered territories and isolated populations provided perfect cover for fictional tales that might have been immediately recognized as false in more familiar settings. Dr. Vasquez's investigation also revealed the mechanical process by which fictional details had accumulated around the original fabrication. Each retelling of the Hoer Verde story added new elements, specific dates, additional witnesses, more elaborate explanations for the disappearance. These embellishments followed predictable patterns that reflected the political biases and cultural assumptions of their creators, rather than any connection to real events. The rifle in the schoolhouse had evolved from a simple hunting weapon in early accounts to military-grade armament in later versions, suggesting government involvement where none had been originally implied. The blackboard message had grown from a simple phrase, to elaborate pronouncements that supposedly revealed the villagers' final thoughts before their disappearance. Each edition made the story more compelling, while further divorcing it from any basis in reality. Most disturbing was her discovery of how the Hoer Verde legend had influenced subsequent research into legitimate Amazon mysteries. Anthropologists and historians had wasted years searching for evidence of the fictional settlement, diverting resources from investigation of real historical events that deserved scholarly attention. The fabricated mystery had become so embedded in academic literature that separating fact from fiction required extraordinary effort. But Dr. Vasquez's most shocking discovery was still ahead evidence that suggested the Hoer Verde story might not have been a simple journalistic fabrication, but rather a deliberately planted piece of disinformation, designed to serve specific political purposes. The implications of that revelation would force researchers to confront uncomfortable questions about the intersection of propaganda, journalism, and historical truth in the 20th century's most turbulent decades. Dr. Vasquez's investigation took a darker turn in November of 1978 when she discovered classified correspondence in Soviet archives that had been recently declassified following détente agreements between Moscow and Western governments. The documents revealed that the Hoer Verde story wasn't simply journalistic fabrication gone viral. It was deliberate disinformation, crafted by Soviet intelligence services as part of a broader campaign to destabilize Western confidence in South American governments during the turbulent 1920s. The revelation came through a single telegram, dated March 3, 1923, buried within thousands of routine diplomatic communications between Moscow and Soviet embassy staff in Buenos Aires. The message, marked with the highest security classifications of the era, contained instructions for Operation Green Phantom, a propaganda initiative designed to exploit real political instability in Brazil by manufacturing evidence of government failures that could be amplified through international media channels. The telegram's clinical language contrasted sharply with the human tragedy it described fabricating. Create narrative of rural population displacement, suggest government inability to protect citizens, ensure story reaches Western publications through intermediary sources, emphasize capitalist exploitation themes. Soviet intelligence had chosen the Amazon as their fictional setting with calculated precision. The region's reputation for mystery and inaccessibility made verification virtually impossible for international journalists, while its recent history of economic collapse provided perfect context for tales of social breakdown. The rubber boom's dramatic end had left dozens of genuinely abandoned settlements throughout the basin, creating a template that made fictional disappearances disturbingly plausible. The name Hoer Verde itself revealed the operation's sophisticated understanding of propaganda psychology. The exotic Portuguese-sounding toponym satisfied international readers' expectations for Amazon place names, while the hidden Dutch vulgarity provided a subtle insult that would be understood by European intellectuals without alerting casual audiences to the story's fabricated nature. Dr. Vasquez discovered that Soviet agents had researched Brazilian geography extensively before crafting their fictional narrative. They understood that the Amazon contained numerous legitimate settlements with Verde in their names, creating perfect cover for their invention. If challenged, they could claim confusion between multiple similar locations, buying time for the false story to spread beyond the reach of Brazilian authorities' corrections. The timing of Operation Green Phantom revealed strategic thinking that connected the Hoer Verde fabrication to broader geopolitical objectives. Soviet intelligence had launched the campaign during Brazil's Revolution of 1923, when genuine political instability made fictional disasters appear entirely credible. International audiences already concerned about South American chaos found the vanished village story perfectly consistent with their existing fears about regional breakdown. The classified documents revealed how Soviet agents had seeded the story through multiple channels simultaneously. Pravda published the original account, but intelligence operatives also fed versions to left-wing publications in Paris, London, and New York, each tailored to local political concerns. French communist papers emphasized colonial exploitation themes, while British socialist publications focused on capitalist oppression of indigenous peoples. This multi-channel approach created an echo chamber effect that made the fictional story appear independently verified. When the same basic narrative appeared in publications across multiple countries, international audiences assumed they were reading confirmed reports from different sources rather than variations of a single fabricated tale. Soviet intelligence had essentially weaponized the era's primitive fact-checking capabilities. The sophistication of Operation Green Phantom extended to anticipating and countering potential debunking efforts. Soviet planners understood that Brazilian authorities would eventually investigate the story and find no evidence of Hoer Verde's existence. To neutralize such challenges, they embedded suggestions within their original narrative that the Brazilian government might be covering up the disappearance to avoid international embarrassment. This preemptive inoculation against contradiction proved remarkably effective. When Brazilian officials later insisted that no settlement named Hoer Verde had ever existed, international publications often interpreted their denials as evidence of government cover-up rather than simple statements of fact. The absence of evidence became proof of conspiracy rather than indication of fabrication. Dr. Vasquez found additional evidence of Soviet manipulation in the story's evolution across different publications. Details that appeared in various international versions, the rifle in the schoolhouse, specific quotes from alleged witnesses, descriptions of government investigation efforts had been carefully coordinated to create the illusion of expanding knowledge about a real event. Each new revelation had actually been planned in advance to sustain international interest and credibility. The operation's success exceeded its creators' expectations. By 1925, the Hoer Verde story had achieved such widespread acceptance that legitimate academic researchers began investigating the disappearance as a genuine historical mystery. Universities allocated resources to Amazon expeditions seeking evidence of the vanished settlement, while anthropologists incorporated the tale into broader studies of indigenous settler conflicts in frontier regions. This academic validation provided the fictional story with institutional credibility that Soviet intelligence could never have achieved through propaganda channels alone. When respected universities and scholarly publications began treating Hoer Verde as historical fact, the fabrication effectively entered the permanent record as legitimate history. The psychological impact extended far beyond academic circles. The Hoer Verde legend influenced public perceptions of South American stability for decades, reinforcing stereotypes about Latin American chaos that affected everything from diplomatic relations to investment decisions. Soviet intelligence had successfully planted a fictional narrative that shaped real-world attitudes toward an entire continent. Dr. Vasquez's research revealed similar disinformation campaigns targeting other regions during the same period. Soviet intelligence had fabricated stories of mysterious disappearances in Africa, unexplained disasters in Asia, and government cover-ups throughout the developing world. The Hoer Verde operation was part of a global strategy designed to undermine Western confidence in non-communist governments by creating an atmosphere of persistent crisis and institutional failure. The Amazon provided an ideal laboratory for such manipulation because its genuine mysteries provided perfect camouflage for fictional additions. Real unexplored territories, authentic indigenous conflicts, and documented environmental dangers made fabricated stories blend seamlessly with legitimate news from the region. International audiences couldn't distinguish between actual Amazon mysteries and manufactured ones because both seemed equally plausible given the jungle's reputation for harboring impossible phenomena. But the most disturbing aspect of Operation Green Phantom wasn't its initial success. It was how the fictional narrative had achieved permanent status in historical literature, despite decades of evidence proving it's fabricated. Nature. The story had become too embedded in academic tradition, too useful for various political purposes, and too compelling as pure narrative for truth to dislodge it entirely. The implications stretched far beyond a single false story about a vanished Amazon village, raising fundamental questions about the relationship between information, power, and historical truth. In an era when propaganda techniques were becoming increasingly sophisticated, how many other historical events might actually be deliberate fictions that achieved credibility through repetition and institutional acceptance? And what did the Hoer Verde operation reveal about humanity's willingness to believe compelling stories, even when evidence contradicted them? The final irony of the Hoer Verde mystery revealed itself in 1998, 75 years after the fictional village's supposed disappearance, when a major documentary production spent over $2 million searching the Amazon for evidence of a settlement that had never existed. This expensive futility illustrated how successfully fabricated stories could embed themselves in cultural consciousness, becoming more real than reality itself through sheer persistence and institutional acceptance. The documentary team, armed with the latest GPS technology, satellite imagery, and sophisticated ground-penetrating radar, methodically explored every tributary and backwater where the vanished village might have stood. They interviewed elderly caboclos, whose grandparents had navigated Amazon rivers during the 1920s, consulted with indigenous shamans who maintained oral histories spanning generations, and analyzed soil samples for traces of human habitation that might have survived decades of jungle reclamation. Their expedition produced stunning footage of genuine Amazon mysteries, uncontacted tribes, glimpsed through telephoto lenses, species of birds unknown to science, archaeological sites that hinted at civilizations predating European contact. But they found no evidence of Hoer Verde, because there was no evidence to find. The team's leader, Dr. Michael Harrison from Cambridge University, admitted defeat in terms that revealed how completely the fictional narrative had colonized academic thinking. We've proven that whatever happened to Hoer Verde, the truth is more complex than any simple explanation can accommodate. The absence of evidence may itself be the most significant evidence of all. This reasoning, treating absence of proof as confirmation of mystery rather than indication of fabrication, demonstrated the psychological power of compelling narratives to resist contradictory facts. Dr. Harrison and his team had encountered overwhelming evidence that Hoer Verde never existed, yet they chose to interpret their findings as proof of deeper mysteries rather than simple hoax exposure. The documentary's broadcast in 1999 introduced the Hoer Verde legend to global audiences through the internet for the first time. Within months, websites dedicated to unexplained disappearances and government cover-ups had seized upon the story, creating an online mythology that made the original Soviet disinformation campaign seem primitive by comparison. Digital technology amplified every aspect of the fabrication's original success. The internet's global reach eliminated the geographic barriers that had once limited story propagation, while its democratic publishing model allowed anyone to add new details to the evolving narrative. Chat rooms and forums became virtual laboratories where fictional elements could be tested, refined, and integrated into increasingly elaborate mythologies. The Hoer Verde story's migration from Soviet propaganda to internet legend perfectly illustrated how misinformation adapted to changing media landscapes while maintaining its essential appeal. Each technological advance, from telegraph to radio to television to internet, provided new opportunities for false narratives to spread, evolve, and achieve institutional credibility through repetition and apparent independent verification. Modern research into the psychology of misinformation has revealed why fabricated stories like Hoer Verde prove so resistant to debunking. Compelling narratives trigger emotional responses that overwhelm rational analysis, making people more likely to believe information that confirms existing fears or expectations, regardless of factual accuracy. The vanished Amazon village tapped into deep anxieties about civilization's fragility, government competence, and humanity's relationship with the natural world. These same psychological vulnerabilities that made audiences in 1923 susceptible to Soviet disinformation continue to influence information consumption in the 21st century. Social media algorithms actively amplify content that generates emotional engagement, creating perfect conditions for false narratives to achieve viral distribution before fact-checkers can respond effectively. The Amazon continues to provide fertile ground for such manipulation. Its reputation for harboring undiscovered wonders and unexplained phenomena makes it an ideal setting for fictional stories that blur the line between possible and impossible. Recent fabrications about lost civilizations, undocumented species, and government conspiracies follow patterns established by the original Hoer Verde operation, suggesting that lessons learned from studying historical disinformation remain relevant for understanding contemporary challenges. Perhaps most troubling is how the Hoer Verde case reveals the permanent damage that successful disinformation can inflict on historical understanding. Despite overwhelming evidence of the story's fictional nature, it continues to appear in books, documentaries, and websites as a genuine mystery worthy of investigation. Academic resources that could be devoted to studying real Amazon history get diverted to chasing Soviet phantoms, while public understanding of the region becomes distorted by fictional narratives that seem more compelling than mundane facts. The persistence of belief in Hoer Verde among educated audiences suggests that intelligence agencies' investments in narrative warfare during the Cold War continue paying dividends long after their original political objectives became obsolete. Soviet intelligence succeeded in creating a piece of cultural mythology that outlasted the Soviet Union itself, demonstrating the long-term power of well-crafted disinformation to shape human understanding. Yet there's also hope in Dr. Vasquez's methodical debunking of the legend. Her research demonstrates that truth, however complicated and time-consuming to establish, ultimately possesses greater power than fiction when researchers commit to following evidence wherever it leads. The tools exist to distinguish fact from fabrication. They simply require more effort and intellectual courage than most people are willing to invest. The Hoer Verde mystery ultimately vanished, not because 600 people walked into the Amazon jungle in February of 1923, but because one researcher in 1978 refused to accept compelling fiction as satisfying substitute for documentary truth. Her example suggests that the most powerful weapon against disinformation isn't technology or regulation, but the patient application of critical thinking to claims that seem too perfectly dramatic to be real. In an age when fictional narratives spread faster than factual corrections, when emotional engagement often trumps evidentiary analysis, and when institutional credibility can be manufactured through repetition across multiple platforms, the Phantom Village of Hoer Verde serves as both warning and instruction manual. It shows how easily societies can be manipulated by stories that confirm their fears, while providing a blueprint for resistance through methodical investigation and intellectual honesty. The 600 villagers who never lived in a place that never existed continue to haunt the Amazon not as ghosts, but as permanent reminders of humanity's dangerous willingness to embrace beautiful lies over uncomfortable truths. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.